Plume. Plume had been ecstatic when Ether had summoned a blessing to save the crumbling castle. However, upon examining the effects of the blessing, she discovered it hadn't repaired any of the damage caused by the curse. It had merely prevented further damage to the foundation. That was still ample for her to work with. She had made enough repairs that the structure would remain intact until she had additional time to finish it. Diligently, she and Tim spent weeks working to interchange the support beams in the mines beneath the castle. They faced pushback from the other architectural mages, but Plume made do with the resources she had. Tim even picked up a copy of one of Emerand's works to improve their process efficiency, but she assumed he wouldn't finish it until their job was nearly complete. Plume slogged through Yarrow's neurobiology texts and stroked his ego a few times when she asked him to clarify a few technical details. She detested pandering to him. She could circumvent Admonition's pride because she could work without him. Without Yarrow, she could not have understood the science underlying the protective tome well enough to teach it. On a visit with Yarrow to return his texts, Plume sat in his office taut leather chair on the opposite side of his desk. I wanted to ask one last question. You have some notes scribbled in the margins regarding the possibility of applying the science to manipulating someone else's defensive barrier. Did further research come of that? Indeed. My dissertation was on performing surgical cuts within a colleague's barrier of health when I attended the college. I'd love to read it. She leaned toward him and rested her elbows on his desk, accidentally scattering a stack of parchment papers. And that's not pandering, that's the truth. I have a copy here. Yarrow traded the manuscript for her text and then rearranged the papers back into their neat corner. Thank you. I started imagining what incredible work could be done in architecture if a mage could cast their sorcery inside a fellow mage's barrier without being physically placed inside it. Repair work would be enormously safer and easier. New construction would also be facilitated. Including the work you're doing now? He asked. Not the work in the mines, but the cracked stone in the upper levels should be replaced, and those theoretically are supposed to be fortified. But aren't necessarily. Much is not. For the sections that are, it would be safer and require much less coordination if I could do it without having Crockett or Gable release their hold over a section. And here I had been hoping I could make a healing mage out of you. She pressed a hard look at him. I don't need a third mage class. A third. Yarrow squinted, then stuck out his lower jaw and pressed his lips together. Oh, Hanksuk, what did I do? I'm seeking employment as a combative mage. That's what I went to school for. Ah. But if I can spare enough time to finish reading your dissertation, I was wondering if you'd consider authoring a joint architectural tome with me. Yarrow straightened, but then he sank back. I do not know the holy language. I'm not surprised. I do. His eyes widened in yearning. Restrained, he said, I would be delighted to co-author a tome with you, but let's chat again after you've finished reading my research. As I hear it, you're about to become quite busy. In her evenings, Plume read Yarrow's dissertation anytime she wasn't helping Ether with the tome to safeguard his mind against delusions. Slowly, Ether became less callously seductive and more concerned with the task. He made good progress, but she did not believe he would complete the tome before her contract with the High King ended. To finish his studies, he'd have to leverage Yarrow to learn the science and possibly the High Priest if he struggled with the language. She wasn't sure how much longer the High King would keep her on his staff, but she assumed her time in the castle would end soon with the completion of her contract. In an update meeting with Admonition, she received her answer.
What is the current status of your efforts?
Tim and I have finished the refortifications in the mines. However, there is still damage from the curse in the castle's stone.
You have a week.
I do not know if it could be completed in a week. The curse stretches into most sections of the castle. If only I could have spared more time focusing on Yarrow's research. It could be done in the allotted 10 days.
You said you could complete the project in weeks. It has been weeks. If it goes on longer, it will be turns of the moons.
We were told to repair the mines. We did. Even so, I could have repaired all the damage, at the initial time of assessment, in weeks. However, we had to obtain merchants' approval to work in their portions, which took extra time, and the curse created additional structural deficiencies. The distribution of the load will need to be carefully handled as I'm replacing the wall sections. It would be unsafe to rush the progress. It will require full cooperation with my fellow architectural mages to lift their protective barriers in just the right ways so I can complete the repairs. Admonition did not receive the news well.
You have a week to complete the assignment. After that, our regular staff will take over.
Your regular staff isn't concerned with anything outside of their own areas and pet projects.
Get it done,
Admonition said curtly. Plume kept her tongue behind her teeth as she left the room. She shook her head, but that was her only sign of expression. At best, I could finish in 2 weeks. If I skirt safeguards, I could maybe push a week and a half. In a castle this size, with the number of stories it has resting atop one another, it would be unethical to leave even the slightest crack in a supporting structure. How can I explain that to Admonition? Even if I did, he probably wouldn't care. The longer Plume lived in Athlia, the more she understood the expected protocols. She didn't follow such guidelines, but she understood them. Plume learned how many different tasks Admonition dealt with on the daily. It also didn't mean that she took pity on him or liked him, but she respected that he wanted a standard system to complete his job, even if it was to the detriment of her own. Technically, she should have had the rest of the day off, but with her time frame, she would have to start working on the ground level repairs before first sun high. But she had chores to do first. She needed to go into the market to stock up on food. She wouldn't have time to leave the third wall during the week. Early in her arrival, she realized it was much more affordable to prepare her food rather than purchase every meal from the castle's kitchens. She needed to check with the castle's laundress to grab her clothes. She needed a shower. She needed to tell Tim of her deadline. She needed to tell Ether too. At least I'm fully confident Tim will continue whatever work I leave behind. It would encroach into his responsibilities, though. Who knows how much the others will pile on him once I leave. He's risked everything for me. While I enjoy Tim's company, we're only work friends, and I can't ask him to risk his career. I must get as much done as possible. Perhaps I can have multiple spells running simultaneously. Maybe not sleep. Something. Plume would let her subconscious mull over potential solutions while she completed her chores. She descended from Admonition's office in Pinite's Tower through the first, second, and third walls to exit to the castle's markets. She passed one of her favorite merchants, and she admired the twisted craftsmanship of their furniture. She had no idea how the crafter molded the wood, and she usually could figure out how to make almost anything. But these were masterpieces. It would be unrealistic to transport such heavy furniture to another kingdom, but if she ever obtained long-term employment in the impenetrable castle, she would buy a whole bedroom set. She smiled and waved at the merchant staffing the booth before passing on. She didn't know his name or the names of his other workers. They had all been friendly whenever she gawked at their works. Remembering her deadline, she pulled herself away from the woodworking and pushed on to the fruit stalls. She purchased enough for the next few days. On the return trip to her chambers, Plume popped her head into the laundry, and the servant Cloth told her she had nearly finished it. One fewer concern. As soon as Plume set her purchases inside her room, she was off again. This time, she was headed for Tim's room. When she knocked, he called, "A moment!" After a bit of rustling, he opened the door, disheveled. "If it isn't my favorite coworker." His wife hid in their bed, holding the covers over herself. "Hi, Lime. Sorry for the intrusion." Plume didn't have time to be embarrassed. "No worries." "What's going on now?" "How do you know something's wrong?" "You only come here when there is." He was right, but she didn't address it. "My contract will be terminated in a week. Admonition just told me. I have until then to finish all the repairs in the castle." He bit down a sarcastic smile. "Of course." He pressed his head against the doorframe. "What are we gonna do?" "I'm going to do it. I know you've been assigned to construct the stands for the Festival of the Wyvern, but I wanted to let you know that I'll be leaving soon. I'll still have time to help you." "If you do not truly, please don't," she said. "If I don't see you again, it's been a pleasure." She grasped forearms with him. "Likewise," he said. "But we'll see each other again. You still have to show me how to juggle those fireballs." "Of course, how could I forget?" She backed away from his room to plan her next step. He closed the door, and she continued. The stone surrounding the practice yards desperately needed attention. Typically, to fix the cracks, an architectural mage's barrier would first have to exclude the section she was working on. Then she would remove each stone individually, transfer the load onto her sorcery, and then swap with a new, uncracked stone. The castle had layers of granite blocks, and while that was a solution, it was generally reserved for lighter stones. "The others will resist lowering their barriers until I've run out of time. They'll fight me every step of the way and then blame me for failing. If only I could have finished Yarrow's dissertation already." She considered heating the stone to weld the cracks closed. any chance she could utilize her combative magic, she loved to. However, when metal beams were welded back together, the welded section would become stronger than the material surrounding it, and in some cases, unintentionally act as a knife, ripping through the softer surrounding beam from the pressures of the weight bearing down upon it. She did not know if the same would occur for the stone, but she would not risk it. Alternatively, she could fill in the cracks with smaller stones and sediment, as a healer might fill in a lousy tooth after excavating out the ruined bone. She wasn't sure how well that would work either. Wizardry would be an excellent solution, if only I had more than a week to craft a spell tome for it. Scanning through all possibilities, she would not have time to interchange the stones safely. Her best option was to fill in the cracks. To do that, Plume would have to hug the stones while feeding the material to bind them into place. That would be the only way to slip her magic inside her colleagues' fortification barriers. It would be inconvenient, but more than that, it would be humiliating. No matter, it will have to be done. I'll get a better sense of guiding the mixture anyway if I have extra contact with the walls. I'll also need to find a material to match the strength of the stone. Plume trotted to the architectural mage's office and searched through old files. During the off time, no one was around to stop her from looking. Some of the drawers were locked, and nothing she found was much of note. The only documents she discovered were the site plans for previous construction projects and records of different jobs. There had been no signs of original research in the office. Unsurprised, she left and headed for the library. She had a similar lack of luck searching the shelves there. Seemingly at the end of her resources, Plume slunk into a chair and balanced her head in her hands. Sliding them around to the metal hair clip holding her thick bun, she needed to come up with something. A solution dawned on her, but she dreaded it. If the material does not exist, I can make it myself. I'll need to find an alchemist and conduct research using their supplies, but I can theoretically do it. It was beyond her responsibility to do so. Plume could leave the project incomplete, but then she'd be no better than the thick bloods that let the issue escalate in the first place. Reluctantly, she admitted that she had to try. She cursed that this was going to take so much additional effort for such a short time frame, but she got to work. Plume had no idea where an alchemist might work in the castle. However, she had an idea who might know. As a tanner, Lime would need to receive substances from an alchemist to treat her leathers properly. Therefore, she should know where the alchemist worked in the castle. Plume banged on Tim's door again. "What, Plume?" Tim called. "Where are the Crown's alchemists?" she asked. "What?" Tim opened the door. He only looked slightly more put together than when she last saw him. "The alchemists. Where do they work?" She turned her gaze to Lime. "Are you going to fill the cracks with gold and alcohol?" He laughed to himself. Plume glared at Tim. "I can show you," Lime said, "after I get dressed." Tim's mouth fell open in protest. "Thank you, Lime." Plume smiled at Tim's exasperated face. "It'll be quick." Tim closed the door to allow Lime her privacy. Soon, Lime emerged and directed Plume with an upturned palm. "This way." To avoid silence, Plume asked, "How has work been going?" "We're preparing for crowds during the festival, so it's been busy. It's a shame that you won't be around for it this rotation," Lime said. "It would have been nice to see, but the festival of the Jackalope will be soon thereafter," Plume said. "You'll go back to Hyeri then?" she asked. Plume didn't have a backup plan. She had intended to make enough of an impression that the High King contracted her services long term, but she would never return to Hyeri if she could help it. She had finally escaped. The only one there now for her was her mother. "No, I don't think I will. I'll explore first." "I hope you find somewhere you like. What kind of alchemist did you need, by the way? I go to Alum for my leathers, but I do not know if he will be familiar with what you need." "I'll need someone familiar with stonework or the like. Master Verdigris might be more familiar with that." Plume assumed that the alchemists wouldn't delve into this sort of work at all. She primarily wanted to use their supplies. If someone could lend her aid, all the better. "That would be lovely. Will they be in today, though?" "Given the nature of their research, they are often working when others are not," Lime said. "There's a decent chance most of them will be in their laboratory." Plume smiled at the prospect. The alchemist's laboratory hadn't been too many floors away from the architect's office. "Here we are," Lime said. "Thank you, Lime, and I apologize for interrupting your morning." "You're welcome. I needed a reason to rise from bed anyway." Lime reached out a hefty hand and squeezed Plume's forearm. With a grin, she left. Plume stuck her head into the main office. A few servants were tidying up stacks of paper. She entered and asked Sponge, "Do you know if Master Verdigris is here?" The young man pointed at himself questioningly. Plume hated how the mages treated servants that he would have such a reaction. Yes, Sponge. I believe so. Yes, ma'am. She made eye contact when he avoided her gaze in favor of looking at the floor. Thank you. Entering into the lab, she called, Is Verdigris here? The mix of men and women looked up from what they were doing, and one raised a couple fingers to signal his position. The alchemic mage used a contraption of lenses strung together with metal wire to investigate the contents of a glass tube. When his bright orange eyes swiveled to Plume, she viewed his face full on. He was in the middle rotations of life. His white cloak contrasted with his skin, which was dark like hers. How can I be of assistance? He asked. I'm interested in a compound that can seal stone as if it had never been broken. Something better than mortar? He asked. Yes, it needs to be able to bear weight, a lot of weight. I doubt there's anything that seals damage that well, but we might get close. She smiled at his optimism. I can work on it 3 turns of the moon from now. My other projects have been piling up, Master Verdigris said. What was your name? Plume, and I can't wait that long. I need to finish my project in a week. Could I work on it here on my own? He looked at her, confused. Aren't you an architectural mage? Yes, and I need to find a solution immediately. Well, you are more than welcome to find a stool and use the equipment so long as you clean up after yourself. If you don't mind, I will get working right away, she said. He gestured to an empty stool along the bench next to him as he returned to studying the mixture through the lenses. She looked at the cabinets above that housed chemicals in glass bottles and pre-brewed potions in sealed jars. What usually makes mortar? Without looking up, he answered, Lime, water, sand, mud, clay. You can get creative. There's a book on it under the workstation on the opposite side of the lab. Thank you. At a minimum, she required a couple chunks of granite to test her new substances. A wild idea sprung to her head. I'll be right back. Plume raced between the servants carrying loads of laundry or baskets of fresh deliveries. She ran straight for Crockett's private office. From a non-load-bearing wall that separated his office from the general gathering area, she sidled against the stone and stole a massive granite block. She levitated it up the few floors back to the laboratory with her. She set it on the workstation in front of her stool. Wielding her combat magic precisely, she sliced the block into equally small workable sections. Then she hammered her force fields against some of the blocks until they cracked. For later, she noted how much force she required to break one of the blocks. The entire time she worked, Master Verdigris focused on his research, unconcerned with the ruckus she was causing. Plume retrieved the book on mortar from the other side of the lab. On the shelf, books ranged from drug encapsulation for controlling latency effects to the elimination of vermin given various doses of poison. None of the other works could be useful for her purposes, but the book on mortar would at least provide a chemical formula. Lime, otherwise known as calcium hydroxide, when mixed with sand, silicon dioxide, and water, hydrogen dioxide, would harden and make a relatively soft bond compared to stone or brick surrounding it. She would start working with different portions of silicon, calcium, hydrogen, and oxygen. If she altered the percentages of an element in the right way, perhaps it would give her what she needed. If not, she would move on to add additional components to the mixture. She got to work. When it came time to test a new mixture, she sealed the crack in one of the little granite blocks with it. She would wait for it to set, which unfortunately took a day or more. Then, she would unleash her force field upon it. Because the process took so long, she tested multiple mixtures at a time, and she read Yarrow's research while she waited. Her initial attempts cracked quickly. Occasionally, she'd hear a comment or curse uttered from Verdigris or one of the other alchemists in the lab. Sometimes, she would be the one to make an unintentional remark when an experiment failed. She liked the atmosphere. Everyone worked on a separate project together. She was still happy to retire to the library shelves at the end of each day, though. During her early trials, Yarrow found her. Ah, I had heard you were up here, but I had to see for myself. Adding yet another mage class to your collection. Some of the alchemists stared at Yarrow as he interrupted their work. Some glared at Plume for being on the receiving end. She whispered, No, I still consider this architectural work. Yarrow maintained his volume as he perused the spines of the shelved books. I see. I wanted to inquire whether you would still be interested in co-authoring the tome you mentioned. Her expression fell. I couldn't right now. I'm far too preoccupied. A thin, knowing smile spread across his face without touching his eyes, as I expected from Admonition's last High Council meeting. Why did you attend a High Council meeting? You hadn't heard. High Prince Jet and High Queen Iolite have taken ill. Our High Healing Mage has been treating them. Gentian hasn't been able to perform his regular duties, so I've been attending the High Council meetings, running the herb shop, tending to patients, maintaining the barrier of health, and everything else. A dozen questions flew through Plume's mind. She whispered her most pressing one. How did they fall ill under Master Gentian's existing barrier? It's a mystery, but I have full faith the pair will recover soon. Plume switched to her next concern. During the High Council meeting, admonition said that my deadline soon approached? Something like that. Exasperated, Plume pleaded, Master Yarrow, please tell me. I tried to spare your feelings, but if you'll have it from me, then take it. He anticipated your impending departure. He scheduled the High Transportation Mage to send you back to Hyeri on the day of your contract's termination. She grimaced. I'm disappointed, but not surprised. Anyway, if you find surplus time, I'd be interested in co-authoring the tome with you. However, I ought to return to work. I, too, am quite overwhelmed. About time, Ella muttered across the laboratory. On Plume's third day of research, she had one stone block that held against a medium-strength force field that the others hadn't withstood. It broke before she unleashed the strongest one, but it was progress. She checked its formula and made a dozen other tests, a third of them with the same structure, the other 2/3 with varying degrees of difference. She filled in the cracks of the next test blocks and then left them alone to set for the following day. He knew could set, but she made a couple more mixtures anyway. If Ether was angry with her for being late, then so be it. He could do to learn patience. But just after the first sundown, he came looking for her, in the laboratory instead. She rushed to scribble in her notebook. She couldn't forget the results while speaking with him. Almost done? He asked. If he hadn't come looking for her, Plume would have conducted one more test. She was running out of time, uncertain how long it would take to make enough mixture to fix all the cracks. Even when she perfected the formula, she knew it wouldn't be instantaneous. She would need time to fill them in across the castle, too. She cleaned up her bench and Ether watched until he sighed and perused the lab. He leafed through the book on mortar while she washed her emptied test tubes in the lab's fountain. A gripping read? He teased. Probably as informative as your tome. I would prefer to have a protected mind than a structurally sound wall. He tossed it around on the lab's bench edge. I don't know of anyone who died from an illusion, she countered. With a tiny force field, she slid the book farther onto the table. Plenty have died from collapsed structures. Alum and one of the alchemists stared at Ether. Master Verdigris paid no attention. I'll meet you up in the library. I have to finish up cleaning my workspace. I can wait. As Ether played with the lenses and vials, Verdigris observed him with a disapproving frown. Okay, she said, ignoring Ether until she was finished. As soon as she had, she faced him. Ready. Stepping out of the lab, Ether asked, Has anyone asked you about Crockett's office block going missing yet? Not too loud, she hushed. But no. A mischievous glint came to her eyes. Thought so. They'll figure it out if they poke around the alchemist's lab and find the dozens of granite cubes lying around. I've personally disposed of everything myself, and I'll wear my emerald robes for luck. That's probably for the best. You'll need as much luck as you can get. There are so many gossips around the castle that secrets don't stay that way for very long. As long as I get the job done, I don't care what people are saying about me. I sacrificed one non-load-bearing block for the sake of saving the castle. How tragic that Crockett lost his privacy as a byproduct. Plume couldn't have loaded her last words with any more sarcasm if she tried. Why are you working so hard? You weren't even hired for this. This might be a valuable chance to get through to the spoiled Archspawn. If he's willing to listen, then I'm going to seize the opportunity. Because the High King hired me to solve a problem. It's not quite what he thought it was, but I'm aware of what it is, so I'm going to do it. Ether frowned. Inventing a new material seems outside the scope of your position. It's beyond reasonable expectation. If it is, I'm happy to surpass expectations, but I'm also disheartened that everyone doesn't hold themselves to the highest standard they can. I have to be careful not to seem like I'm accusing him of holding low standards of integrity. Ether didn't act as though he was offended, though. For someone who isn't in your position, what does that look like? We've finally arrived at self-reflection. Exhausting all potential solutions, making hard choices, exerting extra energy, in some cases just continuously trying to improve. Sounds tiresome. Ether wrinkled his nose in jest. Maybe I've been too optimistic. It is. I've never been so weary. Though she kept the conversation light to keep Ether engaged, Plume also didn't want to downplay her efforts with too much banter. What would you think that would mean for me, if I were to implement your rigorous standards? You want to rise to the challenge? Of course, as the Archspawn, I should encourage honorable behavior through my own actions. What I say next could get me into worse trouble than any amount of property damage I cause to the castle. I have no claim to guide the Archspawn on his spiritual journey. She exhaled a staggering breath while deciding on her words. I would consult with conviction on what it might mean for you, or you can meditate on it and decide for yourself. Give me a real answer. He locked eyes with her. I guess I have no choice. Plume's mind raced. In your position, I think it means acting bravely when you have the chance to stand up for something. Your opinion has sway, even if you have no army to lead or gem to finance. I can't think of a specific scenario now, but I bet there will come a time when you have the choice to influence a decision, and the easy thing will be to avoid it, but the right thing will be to confront it. Do you think I should call off the crusade? He asked. The festival of the Wyvern is approaching, and all the monarchs will be here to celebrate. The southern party will march through here after that. Should I deliver a message during the festival sermon about ending the violence, about disbanding the party? There's no way I can give him an answer to that. I don't know if that's right. I'm not familiar enough with the situation to judge. Ether sighed, but continued along their way to the library. I don't know either. The Rysik representative keeps begging me to appeal to Panite's mercy, but thus far, I've gone along with supporting the crusade without putting any thought into whether I should or not. Then dedicate time to learning about it so that you can make a more informed decision. I can't believe I have to tell him this. Yet how livid would admonition or conviction be to hear me say it? I will. I suppose it isn't really an issue of showing mercy to the whole race, but rather just to a group of outlaws that are breaching our treaty. I doubt I'll think any different later, but I figure I should try to gather a few more perspectives. But after I do, I want to discuss my thoughts with you, and I want your truthful feedback based on what I've concluded. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts. I can't promise anything else. Good. Ether turned with a taunting smile, but then he paused at the base of the next flight of stairs. Hey, Plume. He dropped the humorous demeanor. Ether rarely looks that grave. She gave him a side glance. Yes? Will you stick around until the festival of the Wyvern? It's still half a turn of the moons away. Admonition has my transport to Hyeri scheduled already, and I couldn't afford to stay in the castle for that long without work. I'd have to sleep in the dogwoods. I'll speak to Master Zenith, and I'll pay for your room and board. She took a deep breath, thinking for a moment. You know what, Ether? I would be willing to postpone my departure, but I want to know why you want me to stay. She loved making him uncomfortable. His arrogance radiated through so often otherwise that it was refreshing. You're making me flex my courage already, I see. Ether sucked in a breath. You're the first peer that hasn't used me for selfish ends or political motivations. You've never pushed an agenda on me. You don't care about offending me. It feels like you're honest with me, and I appreciate having someone around like that. Plus, you can relate to my love of books, so that's a bonus. I am honest with you. I'm confident that whatever I do, it's not going to change your decision, whether to save or doom the people of this age. More than likely, I'll be an unremarkable flash in your life, and soon forgotten. Why would you say that? He asked indignantly. I've only known you for a turn of the moons. You'll keep company with royals, Rhysiglai, harpies, dimension hoppers, sea folk, archangels, who knows what else. You'll be involved in vital negotiations your whole life, she said. I'm a sorceress looking for employment. It doesn't quite yield the same weight. I would never forget you. As remarkable as I am, you are also remarkable. You have unmatched integrity, no matter how tedious or difficult your problems are. Panite would be an idiot to let you go to another kingdom. You're the best of the mages here. You should be the high combative mage. She sighed through her nose. Even if that were true, I have no name recognition. No one would accept me in such a position until I prove myself. Then do it, you were just saying. I know what I said, but I have obligations I must fulfill. I'm too busy right now. I mean after. Get Panite to hire you to build a shrine dedicated to me. Design the best, most impressive shrine that he couldn't possibly reject. Present the idea to him before the other mages do. Incorporate combative mage elements into it. It would help if someone had picked their legendary beast by now. Just work off of what I like. Put some books with green leather bindings on it. Instant winner. I can't believe you're trying to convince me to design a shrine in your honor while you're still alive, she said. That's so ostentatious. You're the one who feels like you need to prove yourself. I'm giving you a suggestion, and a suggestion that I could help to sway in your favor. I don't want your sway. If I were to design a shrine or sculpture, which I don't want to because I want to be a combative mage, not an architectural one, then I would want my design selected on its own merit. He smiled. Have it your way. I'm offering it to you as a friend. As a friend, huh? Indeed, I have deemed you worthy of the title. You have much more to offer than a mere courtier or courtesan. Oh, lords, are those my only options? I would otherwise only be a plaything for your body or your brain? I didn't mean it like that. I meant that you were more valuable than only to be used for your body. Wait, that's not what I mean either. When you decide, let me know. She hadn't meant to snap. She'd meant to say it as a joke, to show his poor phrasing didn't bother her, but it came out harsher than anticipated. I mean that you're not a plaything. That puts you in a different category than the other women I'm accustomed to being with. Being with? We aren't together. She halted in the hall in astonishment. I know, I mean a proximity sense, so because you're different than those others, I presumed it meant we were friends. She didn't reply, but she walked forward again. Silence lingered between them, and she let him have a moment to reassess his approach. What I mean to say is that I enjoy your company. I want you around. I want our routine to stay the way it is. I don't want you to leave, ever. Plume shook her head. Nothing stays the same for very long. If it does, it's artificial or something else is wrong with it. Life is constantly changing, and people are constantly adapting, at least a little bit. He seemed frustrated. For a kid who spends most of his time learning to control his emotions, he isn't good at it in practice. They had arrived at the library, but to not disturb those inside, they spoke outside the entrance. Look, I understand that you like spending time together, but I need to find a way to support myself. I need to find work as a combative mage because that's what I find fulfilling. I'd be as hollow as your courtesans without pursuing my passion. I'm going to ask Panite to sign me on as a combative mage here, but he's probably going to reject me, regardless of how great a job I do in my current role. There are no open positions here, I know that, and it means that I'm going to have to move to a smaller city, and soon. But you'll at least stay until the festival. She rolled her eyes. Yeah. He nodded, but his eyes focused on the hard stone floors, as though disheartened by the unfortunate reality. Their lesson was quiet, and they stuck strictly to the material. Previous teachings would have drifted into allegories, stories from their previous days, or other tangents. She didn't discuss her latest progress, and he didn't share any humorous blessing requests from his day. When the session ended, Plume returned to her chambers, exhausted. She just wanted to finish her task and be done with it all. The following day, Plume's formulas provided even more impressive results, to the point that she would fill the real walls with her best performing one. Master Verdigris gave her an approving nod when she found the right fit. Everyone else in the lab had been disturbed by her excited shriek that had accompanied it. Plume named the material granite filler, produced a massive amount of it, and filled in the last of the test blocks for the next day. In the meanwhile, she deposited all the scraps and excess materials into the large rubbish chute in the lab. You can let the servant finish up. Master Verdigris didn't look up from his lenses. We had the good one this week, so it'll actually get cleaned. I don't mind doing it myself. Plume took the granite filler in a spackle tray and some water in a bucket and brought it with her to a non-load-bearing area with superficial cracks. Methodically, she combined the right amount of water with the granite filler, and she guided the mixture into place with her magic. She weaved it through the stone until it filled each crevice. People gave her strange looks as she hugged the walls to set the material, but she didn't have time to mind their judgments. She still had plenty to do, but by the end of the day, she had fixed everything that wasn't essential. If the experiments showed promising results the following day, she would finish either the next day or the following, but still before her deadline. Not that any of the other architectural mages other than Tim would believe her, but at least everyone would be safe. That was the most important in the end. To fill the rest of her time, Plume spent a fraction of a fortune on 3 thin notebooks and copied down her research from her main journal into each. If the results panned out from her last round of tests, then she would write those down too before filing 1 copy of the notebook in the alchemist's office, sending 1 to the mage's college, and sending the last to her mother. For the time being, she hid the books in her room. Not that anyone would steal them, let alone know of their existence, but she would guarantee their safety. She headed for the library to wait for Ether and their nightly lesson, but he didn't arrive on time. She grabbed a book to pass the time until his arrival. When she checked outside, the first moon had nearly reached its apex, and she decided to leave. Although she wasn't particularly surprised, she was disappointed that he hadn't bothered to send a messenger to tell her he wasn't coming. He is still such a child. At least I can read Yarrow's research without being interrupted with his questions every 3 heartbeats. The following day produced the results Plume had been hoping for. She worked on filling crucial cracks, systematically visiting all the locations that required attention. She noticed that the cracks seemed to get larger the deeper into the castle she ventured. By the end of the day, she had discovered the main branch all the corrosive damage had stemmed from. She found herself filling it in within the spacious dungeons. The prisoners directed a range of comments toward Plume when she entered, but she ignored them. They posed no threat to her behind their bars. Before she got to work, the servant Cloth entered. "Good morning, Master Plume. I've slid tomorrow's schedule under your door." "What does Admonition have planned for me this time?" Cloth passed out news parchments to the inmates. "An exit meeting with the High King." Plume paused her work. "Do you remember when?" "Second sun high." "Perfect timing. I'll finish by then." "Thank you for letting me know." She smiled at her in gratitude. "Oi, sweet, why don't you smile at me like that?" one of the prisoners asked. "Smile? I want a kiss," another interjected. The rest laughed. Plume flared her nostrils, but withheld her temper. "I cannot wait to finish this." Cloth hurried to pass out the pages and leave. Ignoring the prisoners, Plume resumed her work. While magically filling in the cracks, she found herself confused. Where solid earth should have been, stones weaved interlocking patterns, and through those stones the cracks followed, growing larger the farther she sensed. Something's down there, but none of the castle's site plans and models show anything past this point. She cast Ether's spell tome, leveraging her sorcery to compensate for her lack of a thorough understanding of the material. Her mind protected itself from illusions. The cat calls ceased. The cells had emptied. Where'd they go? Are they playing a trick on me? Plume searched for the prisoners, but they had vanished. She ran out of the dungeon to ask Cloth if she had seen them escape, but the servant had already gone. What happened? When Plume returned, a new door stood at the end of the row of cells. Where'd that come from? They couldn't have possibly escaped through there while I was working. It was right next to me. I can't believe I hadn't noticed it earlier. Should I enter it? It must have been hidden visually, only revealed once I eliminated the illusions. I shouldn't enter. It gave her a foreboding feeling. There's still time to think. If someone finds me beyond the phony prison, then I'll claim I was being thorough with my work. If I don't complete the section of the castle and it crumbles, I could say I hadn't known about it since it wasn't listed in the designs. As Plume continued working, she couldn't stop debating over the pseudo-dungeon. If anyone was hurt because she knowingly didn't complete her task, she couldn't live with culpability. She would finish the job. It would likely be dangerous to trespass, but it was a danger she couldn't ignore. If something is afoul in the impenetrable castle, I should report it. It was a duty that extended beyond her job again, but it was a responsibility to her king to tell him. She would have her exit interview the following day. She would mention the subject then. Perhaps it's nothing. Perhaps it's the way to a hidden treasury. It would make sense to disguise the vault from everyone. But why not just postcards? Then again, if someone doesn't even know where the entrance was hidden, it would be more difficult to steal the valuables within. All of this Plume mulled over while she was traipsing the halls back to the mage's tower. She had been so preoccupied with the idea that she hadn't noticed the upper sections of the castle weren't nearly as populated as they usually were. There were always crowds of servants and mages and apprentices wandering around. Where is everyone? Tim trekked down the staircase from the architectural mage's office. Hey, Tim! What can I help you with today? Why is it so barren around here? He glanced around. I don't know. It's not abnormal for it to get like this. Was that all you wanted to ask? An excited expression came to her face. I made a sealant that has the same strength as granite. I'm calling it granite filler. If you're interested in it, I'm leaving a copy of the research in the alchemist's office. It might be helpful the next time cracks develop. What an original name. I'd be happy to read it later. I'm going to retire for tonight. I've had a long day constructing the stands. But it's going well with all the practice I've gotten levitating steel beams these last weeks. He backed away while speaking. Once you finish Emeran's works, it'll decrease the required effort significantly. I'm nearly done with the first one, Tim called as he left. Plume smiled as she continued up to her room. After mentioning her work, she completed transferring the notes of the last bits of research into each journal. Then she went to the transportation mage's post. The headline news of the day read, Riceaglide pilfer 7th village. kidnapping Sylvani Lord, nest still unlocated. She couldn't handle the emotional burden to internalize the story at present, so the knowledge slipped to the back of her mind. She'd read it closer to the crusade when she could perhaps do something about it, assuming Ether didn't cancel it. "I'd like to send these 2 booklets," Plume told Sponge, who was temporarily working as a courier receptionist. Plume filled out the paperwork and paid the gem to post the journals to their respective locations. Then she climbed to the mage's office to file the final copy. When she passed the corridor to the alchemist's and architect's offices, she noticed an increase in number of people wandering the halls and felt reassured, especially after Tim hadn't thought anything was off. For the 2nd day in a row, Ether skipped their lessons. Plume considered how many more days she would wait for him to return, but she would be gone soon enough and not need to worry about it. If Ether no longer cared, then she would stick around the library in the evenings until the High King discharged her from service. She wouldn't waste her time lingering between the stacks of books. Either way, she would spend her nights reading. Let Ether skip all he wants. It'll only hurt him to miss out on the instruction. At the thought of the tome, she grabbed it from the shelf. She read select passages. There was a chance she had cast the spell incorrectly, and instead of protecting against illusions, her mind had generated them instead. It was a decent idea, if only it also explained the cracks. She took a breath and skimmed the text. I cast it correctly. She hadn't realized an illusion mage maneuvered within the castle. She wondered if High King Panite did. The following day, she went to the dungeons again, as early as possible. She wanted to finish her assignment for good, and she wanted to know what was behind that blasted door. It was still there, and the prisoners had not returned. The defensive mechanism was still in place around her mind then. If whoever cast the illusion knew what happened to their deceptive puppets in real time, and if an illusion witnessed me enter the dungeon, then the caster would know that I had seen through the trick. Just because I can't perceive the visions anymore doesn't mean that they can't detect me. Plume was glad she hadn't yet entered. She needed to let the spell wear off first, and she needed to discover a method to enter the extra space beyond the dungeons without being watched by the fake prisoners. Thus far, no one had entered or exited. If anyone used the prisons routinely, she imagined she would have seen them by now. Alternatively, Plume could feign innocence. She honestly didn't know what she was getting herself into or whom she was dealing with. She fed the sealant into the cracks from the pseudo-dungeon as far as she could. It was as tedious as waiting for her failed granite filler experiments to harden, but she flexed her patience. The farther away she sent the filler, the less precise she could be with it, but she concentrated as best she could. She worked her way through her entire store of the granite filler, and the work still wasn't done. She filled in the presumptive originating stock, but gaps still spread in all directions, and she had a much better idea of how deep the structure below her went. She postulated that, given the secrecy, it was a demoness shrine. Perhaps I won't recast the spell, but rather temporarily put the barrier in place around my mind and switch between seeing the illusions and not seeing them. That way, I can navigate the structure without worrying whether I might have company. She'd look for another, unguarded entrance to enter when the spell wore off. While the magic held, she scoped out the most likely places alternative entrances might reside based on the spacing and layout of the underground structure. She visited them under the pretext she was still fixing the walls, even though her mix had run out. As far as she could tell, no one paid her much attention. Plume threw in a few visits to alternative places as well, to make it look less suspicious that she was looking for a potential entrance. Once she needed to depart the deepest ring of the castle, she made a food run and stopped by the markets. When she collected groceries, she spotted a door that had not previously been visible. She would not check it immediately. It would be far too suspicious. Returning to the lab, she found everyone at their posts. Plume created another batch of the granite filler, and she returned to scope out potential locations for additional doors and to throw someone off her trail if she was being watched. She used the rest of her new batch to finish filling in most of the remaining cracks of the dungeon. To have a plausible cover story, she left the ones at the very bottom alone for 2 reasons. 1, so she could claim she needed to get closer to them to seal them, and 2, so that even if she didn't get to them, chances were that the structure would get along just fine without them being sealed. At that depth, the earth took on most of the weight of the floors above, and she had done a marvelous job reinforcing the ground beneath in her previous weeks. Ideally, she would venture down to the markets right before meeting with the High King so she could tell him what she found, but also so there wouldn't be enough time for the illusionary mage to track her down and silence her. Also, if she went missing, both Admonition and the High King would notice her absence. Plume stalked around the empty markets during the darkest turn, just after Lose had set. The door had disappeared from her vision, and no one was around. For a heartbeat, she created the barrier against illusions to identify the entryway. If she strictly leveraged the tome, there'd be a latency period to wait before she could identify the illusions again, so she bypassed it, solely utilizing her sorcery. Without hesitation, she opened the door, hoping to look like she knew what she was supposed to be doing. She expected it to be locked, but it wasn't. As soon as she opened the door, she regretted it. It reeked of decay. Prison or demon worship? Let's find out. She closed the door behind herself and stalked down the halls, trying to place the layout based on the damage she'd sealed. She palmed the smooth walls and sent out a pulse of magic to sense the design. She assumed this had been a demonish shrine, given that a demon's curse had infected the castle. It made sense. She debated if she should even go any farther. There must be a group of demon worshippers practicing in a hidden space under the castle. The resurrection of ancient illusion magic would make sense that someone adopted it from whatever demon they adulated. A distant memory of a sermon resurfaced regarding Coserai. Plume believed her curses were supposed to have an illusory theme to them. But Plume needed evidence to present to the king, not just speculation. An altar would suffice, although she desperately hoped she wouldn't stumble into an ongoing service. Plume switched off the barrier to see illusions again. No one appeared. After she rounded the next corner, the rotting decay overwhelmed her. What is that smell? She rubbed her palm against the smooth, broken stones to check her position. She was deep in the lair. The door to the market was her closest exit point, and the entrance to the pseudo-dungeons was a half-dozen flights above her. Screams echoed in the distance. Who's screaming? What's happening to them? Footsteps approached, but they faded, and she turned the opposite direction. As quietly as she could, she pressed on, climbing a staircase and creeping farther down a hall. Cages held humans, but none of them called out to her, as the pseudo-prisoners had. Are these people convicts or sacrifices? Between Plume's magic and her eyesight, she gleaned that no demoness symbols marked the floor. No statues or dark flowers honored demons. None of their respective animals decorated the stone either. It was just the cold, unadorned prison cells. Corpse stench assaulted her nose before the dangling, bloodied image petrified her mind. The screams she heard were mechanisms of torture. Hinksuk, bless me. Where had the demon curse come from, then? Perhaps an angry prisoner trying to exact revenge. Perhaps a successful or failed rescue attempt? She didn't know, and she didn't care to find out. Her muscles clenched as her terror built. She backtracked, flicking her vision between what was real and what someone wanted her to see. She took in the few details available. Each hall just looked like an extension of the impenetrable castle. The distant screaming ceased. She was intimately aware of every sound she made, and she stepped as lightly as possible. If someone draws near, they'll hear my heart thumping. Just as she was to return to the long hall back to the door to the Merchant Street entrance, footsteps approached. Bloody stars, why are they coming this way? Can't they leave through the pseudo-dungeons? She squinted in the shadows. She had worn dark clothes for this venture, and with her dark skin and dark hair, she hoped that they would not spot her, even if they advanced from her hallway. So long as my slamming heart doesn't reveal my presence. When the thudding steps resonated down her hall, she retreated into an opposite bend, hoping the person was leaving toward the markets. Sweat pooled in the small of her back as the footsteps approached. As soon as they turned down toward the markets, she nearly relieved herself. Before they rounded the next corner, she caught a glimpse of their clothes. She waited until she heard the door close. When all was quiet, she followed after, careful to give plenty of headway. She arrived at the end of the corridor and left through the door, exalted when peeking sunlight greeted her. Whoever that was, they wore mage's robes. Did I almost encounter the master of these illusions? Plume had just enough time to freshen up before her meeting with Panite. The entire time she kept checking over her shoulder for a potential assassin or a guard waiting to escort her down to the very dungeons she had just visited. If the king knew of the horrors beneath his castle, it would not do her well to reveal her knowledge. At present, there was the possibility she was the only one who knew she knew Admonition arrived at her door. As usual, his unpleasant face wrinkled with a sneer at the sight of her.
"If you will follow me for your exit meeting with the High King."
Plume's nerves were too shot to speak. She nodded. Even though she knew the way to the King's Tower, she allowed Admonition to lead her. For the first time, she was grateful for Admonition's company. When in Panite's office, she had a new apprehension of the defensive mages standing guard outside.
"Plume, Admonition tells me that the reinforcement work has been completed finally," the High King said.
Indeed it has. Technically, it was a lie. She hadn't finished sealing the cracks at the lowest layers of the secret dungeon. She had been too focused on whether the illusions protected demonists or executioners. Once I gain courage again, I will return to finish them. It will not be a lie for long.
"Both you and Spire have my gratitude. Such an immense structure requires a solid foundation, and I recognize that reinforcement work is not always the most satisfying or rewarding."
My main concern is that the citizens of Athlia remain safe and protected. With hidden dungeons, does Panite have his subjects' best interests at heart? Does he even know they exist? If not, who's killing those prisoners?
"Indeed."
"I wanted to inquire about employment opportunities, Your Highness," she said, uncertain she wanted to work in Coserai any longer.
"Admonition handles staffing."
I could dance around the subject, but I don't have anything to lose. I might as well be blunt. Admonition finds me off-putting.
"I can't see why that would be."
Panite tilted his head. I don't stand for his bureaucracy.
"Perhaps I can understand then."
Despite his domineering presence, he joked easily. A smile appeared natural to his face, a face she wanted to trust. "So you see why I'm coming to you with this request, not Admonition."
"I do. However, I do not believe there are any openings for combative mages on my staff. I'm assuming that this is a position you are seeking."
She was flattered he had remembered. If it were any other day, under any other circumstance, she would have been far more pleased. "I am, but I'm disappointed to hear that."
"I have a position for an architectural mage."
"I appreciate the offer, but I am strictly interested in pursuing my career as a combative mage."
"I can write recommendation letters to the other monarchs, but I'm not optimistic I will receive word back. There is a surplus of combative mages. The whole realm is in dire need of mages working in other disciplines."
She nodded. "I'm aware. My professors made that clear. I'd appreciate the letter, though."
"Of course. Is there anything else I can help you with?"
This was the moment she had been waiting weeks for. She had desperately tried to gain an audience with the High King over the arrogantly neglectful manner that Master Crockett and Gable handled the castle's structural concerns. She wanted to explain that they would have let the castle crumble, and she had wanted to discuss her most recent discovery. But now she didn't know if she wanted to tell him. Perhaps it would be better to fade from memory of this place and let it all be bygones. Then Plume imagined a bright-eyed architectural mage, straight out of the Mages' College, hired onto Panite's staff. It might be her dream job until she realized that Crockett wouldn't trust her work, and Gable would have her doing menial tasks like filing paperwork the entire day. It would take her rotations to prove herself to them, and even if she did spectacularly, they would still not allow her the chance to shine. For that future architecture mage's sake, Plume said, "You should reconsider who the High Architectural Mage is. I know that you and Admonition have no extra time to spare, but you're paying him to squash dissent at the potential peril of your citizens. If Master Tympanum had not brought the matter of the crumbling foundation to your attention, Master Crockett would have been happy to let hundreds, if not thousands, lose their lives and allow your reputation to tarnish for not maintaining your castle." The High King relaxed in his chair and studied her carefully.
"And what would my reputation matter in the grand scheme of this scenario?"
Her brows knit together. Panite had accepted her premise and followed her logic, which had surprised her. She assumed he would have advocated for the outdated mage. She continued, "It would be a matter for the safety of the citizens. If the other kingdoms assess your hold as weak, they may challenge you for the throne, or to secede from the united realm. If the Reisigli believe you've overextended your resources, then they'll push the boundaries even farther."
"Why does this concern you?"
"Because I care for this realm. This could have been an easily avoidable issue if he weren't so conceited. He cares only for his legacy and for nothing and no one else."
"What do you want your legacy to be?"
She cringed. I don't care about a legacy. I just want to do what's right. Does he think me a hypocrite? King Panate analyzed her again.
Admonition mentioned that you asked him about his books once.
Carefully, she asked, "What of it?"
An interesting question to pose to my High Vizier.
I asked as part of a metaphor, to communicate my sentiments to him.
I do love a good metaphor.
She wasn't sure what he wanted from her. The High King fiddled with a quill on his desk, then set it down again.
I'll conduct an internal audit to review the standing of my mages, but I would request that you be tested as part of this audit, even though you are no longer formally on my staff. I will cover your expenses until then.
Plume wasn't sure if she had a choice to refuse, but if she were to remain in the castle, she'd be glad Ether wouldn't be responsible for her finances if they weren't even on speaking terms. Will I be reviewed as an architectural mage or as a combative mage?
Both, if you so desire. With the rumors I hear of your capabilities, determination, ingenuity, and loyalty, who knows, perhaps you could earn the title of a high mage for yourself.
She faked a smile, pretending to accept the flattery. Even if Admonition despises me, he could still have relayed my accomplishments accurately to the High King. That would have accounted for the first 3 selections of adjectives. But why would he mention loyalty? I have done nothing to display such a trait. Perhaps he mentioned it as a generic compliment? Perhaps he said it as a threat. Perhaps it's a trait he favors, and its inclusion reflects his preference. Perhaps he views my dedication to integrity ensuring his citizens' welfare as equivalent to loyalty. Perhaps he knows my meetings with Ether and appreciates that I haven't used the Archspawn for personal gain.
Regardless, she was overthinking his motives.
I would like to participate in both reviews, Plume said, if only so I can prove to Crockett that a woman could replace him. But perhaps I shouldn't be so quick to accept the offer. Perhaps I should just accept the High King's recommendation letter and move on somewhere with fewer mysteries. But it wasn't just her own well-being she had to consider. She cared about what happened to Ether and Tim, to Lime and Master Verdigris and Pyrite, the manager of the mines, to Cloth and Parchment and Sponge, the servants. It wouldn't be right to run away, and with that thought, she knew she had made the right choice. She would prepare for the High King's test against the best in the realm.